In the winter of 1879, authorities made a discovery behind St. Stephen's Church in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, that would haunt the coal region for generations to come. When they finally opened the graves, they found that of the 157 coffins buried there over a span of 12 years, not a single one held a human body. Instead, each coffin was filled with carefully arranged stones, weighted to feel like the deceased, while the church's own records showed insurance payouts totaling more than $300,000, an astronomical figure for that era. So what became of those 157 souls, all of whom were said to have died peacefully in their beds? The truth would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined, exposing a web of deception that stretched from the church pulpit to the darkest minds in Pennsylvania. Tonight, we will uncover the complete truth about Reverend Marcus Thompson and the conspiracy that transformed a house of God into a marketplace for human lives. But before we delve deeper into the story of Reverend Thompson and the mysterious graves of St. Stephen's, I have a question for you. This channel is not meant for everyone, only for those with the courage to face the darkest corners of American history. If you are ready to hear the stories others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what truly happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. I'm also curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. Now, let's discover what truly happened in those Pennsylvania coal fields more than a century ago. The truth about St. Stephen's Church begins where desperation and faith collided in the most tragic way possible. By 1867, Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was a town built on coal dust and shattered dreams. Nestled in the Schuylkill County Valley, it was home to nearly 3,000 souls, most of them Welsh and Irish immigrants who had come seeking prosperity in America's booming coal industry. The town's heartbeat was the rhythm of the mines, the pre-dawn whistle calling men into the darkness, the evening bell welcoming them home, and, all too often, the funeral bells marking another life claimed by cave-ins, explosions, or the black lung disease that slowly strangled miners from within. On Elm Street stood St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, its modest brick facade and simple wooden steeple a stark contrast to the elaborate Catholic cathedral across town. This church served the Protestant community, primarily English and German families who had arrived in earlier waves of immigration. Unlike their Catholic neighbors, these Protestant miners often lacked the strong community networks that helped families survive tragedy. When their breadwinners died, Protestant widows frequently found themselves alone, with limited support from both their congregation and the broader community. This isolation would prove crucial to the events about to unfold. Reverend Marcus Thompson arrived in Millbrook in early 1867, a tall, silver-haired man of 45 with pale blue eyes and a voice that could bring comfort to the grieving or fire to the faithful. He came with impeccable credentials. Ordained in Philadelphia, he had previously served congregations in Harrisburg and Allentown, with letters of recommendation from prominent Episcopal bishops. His wife, Catherine, was a refined woman who quickly organized church socials and visited the sick with appropriate devotion. Thompson's arrival was perfectly timed. The previous rector, Reverend William Hayes, had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the congregation without spiritual guidance during one of the deadliest periods in the mine's history. In his first 6 months, Thompson conducted 14 funerals, more than Hayes had performed in his last 2 years combined. But Thompson offered more than just spiritual comfort. He introduced something revolutionary to St. Stephen's, a church-sponsored life insurance program. "My dear brothers and sisters," Thompson announced from the pulpit on a crisp October Sunday in 1867, his voice carrying the authority of a divine mission, "I have seen too much suffering in our community. Too many widows have been left destitute, too many children orphaned, not just of fathers, but of any hope for their future. The Lord calls us to prepare for tomorrow, not merely pray for it." The insurance program was simple and appealing. Church members could purchase life insurance policies through a company Thompson had partnered with, Keystone Mutual Assurance of Philadelphia. The premiums were remarkably affordable, especially compared to other companies that viewed coal mining as too risky. A miner could insure his life for $500, nearly 2 years' wages, for just 50 cents per month. Widows would receive immediate payment upon presenting a death certificate. No questions asked, no lengthy investigations. Within 6 months, over 200 families had enrolled. What made Thompson's program particularly attractive was his personal attention to the bereaved. Unlike other insurance companies that demanded extensive documentation and delayed payments for months, Thompson personally guaranteed that families would receive their benefits within days of the burial. He would handle all the paperwork, coordinate with the insurance company, and even advance money from church funds if necessary, ensuring no family suffered while waiting for their rightful compensation. Another key figure in this arrangement was Dr. Cornelius Whitman, who had recently established his practice in Millbrook. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Whitman was young, ambitious, and eager to build his reputation. He worked closely with Thompson, often waiving his fees for examining the deceased and providing death certificates for church members. This Christian charity, as Thompson called it, was another blessing the Reverend had brought to their community. Completing what seemed like a perfectly coordinated support system was Samuel Crow, the town's undertaker and sexton of St. Stephen's Cemetery. Crow, a somber man of 50 with prematurely white hair and hands permanently stained by his trade, had been serving Millbrook for 15 years. He offered payment plans for funerals, often accepting delayed payment until insurance benefits arrived. His prices were fair, his service dignified, and his discretion absolute. This trinity of care, spiritual, medical, and practical, made St. Stephen's Church a beacon of hope in a community where death was a constant companion. Families felt protected, knowing their loved ones would be properly cared for in death and that survivors would be provided for. The arrangement seemed like a godsend. And perhaps that was exactly how it was designed to appear. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a bitter February morning in 1868, though its significance would not be understood for another 11 years. Thomas McKenna, walking to his shift at the Millbrook mine, spotted a familiar figure trudging along the railroad tracks leading out of town. The man was thin, dressed in rough work clothes, and walked with a peculiar limp that McKenna recognized immediately. It was James Morrison, a fellow miner and member of St. Stephen's Church. The problem was, McKenna had attended Morrison's funeral just 3 weeks earlier. McKenna called out, but the distant figure didn't respond. By the time McKenna reached the spot, the tracks were empty. The early morning mist rising from the coal tipple made visibility poor, and McKenna convinced himself he'd been mistaken. Grief and guilt could play tricks on a man's mind, he knew that from experience. Morrison had died in a mine accident, crushed by a falling support beam. McKenna had been working the same shaft and blamed himself for not warning his friend quickly enough. So, McKenna said nothing. What could he say? That he'd seen a dead man walking the railroad tracks? People would think the coal dust had finally addled his brain. But Thomas McKenna wasn't the only one. Over the following months, other residents reported similar encounters. Mary Sullivan swore she saw her deceased husband, Patrick, buying supplies at a general store in the neighboring town of Centralia. Agnes Fletcher claimed her late son, Benjamin, had appeared at her kitchen window one evening, thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably alive. Each sighting was dismissed by the witnesses themselves, tricks of light, figments of grief-stricken imagination, simple cases of mistaken identity. Yet the reports shared disturbing similarities. These ghosts were always seen at a distance, always in neighboring towns, and always appeared thinner and more haggard than remembered. They never responded to calls, never approached their former neighbors, and seemed to vanish when pursued. When consulted about these visions, Reverend Thompson offered comfort with a theological explanation. Grief manifests in mysterious ways, he counseled from the pulpit. The mind, in its desperate need to hold on to what is lost, sometimes creates what the heart most desires to see. These visions are not supernatural visitations, but rather the natural response of souls struggling to accept God's will. His explanations were reasonable, compassionate, and completely wrong. The truth was far more systematic and infinitely more cruel. What had actually happened to James Morrison was this: on January 15, 1868, Morrison reported to Dr. Whitman complaining of severe chest pains and difficulty breathing, symptoms common among miners, often indicating the onset of pneumoniosis, the black lung disease that eventually claimed most men who worked the coal face. Whitman examined Morrison thoroughly, then delivered devastating news: Morrison was dying. The disease had progressed too far for treatment. He had perhaps weeks to live, certainly no more than months. Morrison was a 34-year-old man with a wife and 3 young children. His life insurance policy through Thompson's program would provide $500, barely enough to cover his medical care, let alone support his family after his death. In his desperation, Morrison made a decision that would condemn him to a fate worse than the disease ravaging his lungs. Dr. Whitman presented him with an alternative. "There is another way," Whitman had said quietly, after ensuring his office door was locked. "A way your family could receive the insurance money immediately, while you address your situation through other means." The proposal was elegantly simple and utterly damning. Morrison would be declared dead of acute heart failure, a common enough cause among miners that no one would question it. His body would be prepared for burial by Crow, his funeral conducted by Thompson, and his family would receive their insurance payout within days. Morrison himself would be transported to work in the deep mines of western Pennsylvania, where labor was desperately needed and questions weren't asked. He could work until his disease claimed him naturally, knowing his family was provided for. "You're dying anyway," Whitman had explained with clinical detachment. "This way, your death serves a purpose. Your family benefits, and you contribute to the industrial progress of our great state. It's a Christian solution to an unfortunate situation." Morrison, faced with the choice between leaving his family destitute or enduring a few years of hard labor while knowing they were secure, chose what seemed like sacrifice. He had no way of knowing he was choosing slavery. The conspiracy was breathtakingly comprehensive. Thompson provided the religious and administrative framework, creating trust and handling insurance paperwork. Dr. Whitman identified suitable candidates and provided false death certificates. Crow prepared weighted coffins and conducted convincing burial ceremonies. A network of labor contractors then transported the deceased to remote mining operations where they worked under assumed names until their real deaths occurred. But Morrison's appearance on the railroad tracks was no coincidence. He wasn't a free laborer heading to a new job, he was a prisoner being transported in chains, part of a human cargo bound for the hellish conditions of the anthracite mines near Centralia, where industrial accidents and cave-ins killed workers faster than they could be replaced. The men operating these mines didn't care about the workers' real names or backgrounds. They paid Thompson and his associates a flat fee for each able-bodied laborer delivered, no questions asked. The workers themselves received nothing beyond minimal food and shelter. They were slaves in everything but name, and most would never see their families again. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Millbrook Method, a systematic process of converting the desperate into the disappeared, transforming tragedy into profit, and turning a house of God into a marketplace for human souls. The success of Thompson's first venture with James Morrison established a template that would be refined and expanded over the following years. What had begun as an opportunistic arrangement with a single dying miner evolved into a sophisticated operation that preyed on the vulnerabilities of an entire community. Thompson's genius lay in his understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. He never approached healthy, prosperous families. Instead, he focused on those already facing medical or financial crisis, men diagnosed with progressive illnesses, families drowning in debt, workers injured in mine accidents who could no longer earn their wages. To these desperate souls, he offered what appeared to be miraculous salvation, immediate financial relief through early insurance payouts in exchange for temporary sacrifice. Dr. Whitman became increasingly skilled at identifying suitable candidates. His medical practice gave him intimate knowledge of which families faced medical bankruptcies, which workers were developing black lung, and which injuries would leave men unable to continue mining. He began requesting regular health examinations for all church members enrolled in the insurance program, a service presented as preventive care, but actually functioning as a screening process for potential victims. "Prevention is the cornerstone of good health," Whitman would announce at church health seminars. "Early detection saves lives and protects families from unexpected hardship." The examinations were thorough and professional, building trust while gathering intelligence. Whitman documented not just medical conditions, but also family financial situations, debt loads, and social connections. Men with large families and limited social networks were particularly vulnerable. They had the greatest incentive to consider drastic measures and the fewest people who might notice their absence. Samuel Crow, meanwhile, perfected the art of simulated death. His background as both undertaker and sexton gave him unique expertise in the practical aspects of death and burial. He developed techniques for creating convincing corpses using sawdust, rags, and stones arranged to approximate human weight and dimensions. The coffins were sealed immediately after viewing, with explanations about rapid decomposition or infectious disease making extended wakes inadvisable. In cases of lung disease, Crow would explain to grieving families, the body deteriorates quickly after death. For the health and comfort of the bereaved, immediate sealing is recommended. The funeral services themselves were elaborate and emotionally overwhelming, designed to prevent close scrutiny. Thompson's sermons during these occasions were particularly powerful, focusing on themes of sacrifice, redemption, and the mysterious ways of divine providence. The emotional intensity left families drained and grateful, not suspicious. Between 1868 and 1870, 12 more men were processed through this system. Each case followed the same pattern: terminal diagnosis or devastating injury, consultation with Dr. Whitman, private meeting with Reverend Thompson, staged death, elaborate funeral, immediate insurance payout, and transportation to remote mining operations. The victims were typically men in their 30s and 40s, old enough to have substantial family responsibilities, but young enough to provide years of hard labor. They came from different backgrounds within the Protestant community: Welsh miners, German railroad workers, Irish farmers who'd turned to mining after crop failures. What they shared was desperation and the belief they were making a noble sacrifice for their families. None realized they were being sold into slavery. The mining operations that purchased these men were concentrated in remote areas of western Pennsylvania, where the demand for expendable labor was enormous and regulation minimal. These weren't established companies with safety protocols, they were illegal or quasi-legal operations extracting coal from dangerous, unstable deposits using methods legitimate companies had abandoned as too risky. Workers in these operations faced conditions that made normal mining seem safe. They worked 12 to 16-hour shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels, used outdated equipment that frequently malfunctioned, and lived in overcrowded barracks with inadequate food and medical care. Death rates were astronomical, but the operators didn't care. Replacement workers could always be obtained through contacts like Thompson. The men who survived more than a few months became shells of their former selves. The combination of extreme physical labor, poor nutrition, constant danger, and complete isolation from their families broke their spirits as effectively as the work broke their bodies. Even if they had escaped, they faced the impossible task of explaining their return from the dead to families who had mourned them and collected insurance money based on their demise. This psychological trap was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire system. The victims became complicit in their own enslavement, unable to reveal the truth without destroying the families they had supposedly died to protect. By 1870, Thompson's operation had generated over $6,500 in insurance payouts, a fortune by contemporary standards. More importantly, it had established him as one of the most trusted and beloved figures in Millbrook. His church membership grew dramatically, drawn by his practical approach to family security and his genuine appearing concern for his congregation's welfare. The Keystone Mutual Assurance Company, far from being suspicious of the high death rate among St. Stephen's policyholders, was actually pleased with the arrangement. Thompson's prompt submission of documentation and the lack of disputed claims made Millbrook one of their most profitable markets. They even began recommending Thompson's methods to other agents as an example of effective customer service. But the system's very success would lead to its expansion and eventual exposure. Thompson had created something too profitable to remain small, too successful to avoid attention, and too dependent on human misery to continue indefinitely without consequences. The shadows of the past were about to give way to the darkest chapter of the conspiracy. As Thompson prepared to scale his operation to levels that would ultimately doom it, what had begun with one desperate miner would soon encompass entire families. The methodical approach of individual salvation would evolve into something resembling wholesale slaughter. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was not whether Thompson and his associates were criminals; that would become undeniably clear. The question was whether they had convinced themselves they were doing God's work, or whether they had simply discovered that evil, when dressed in religious clothing and presented with compassionate rhetoric, could flourish in plain sight within a community desperate enough to believe in miracles. The transformation of Thompson's operation from opportunistic crime to systematic atrocity began in the spring of 1871 with an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Colonel Harrison Blackwood arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday morning, stepping off the Pennsylvania Railroad wearing an expensive suit and carrying leather satchels that suggested serious business. Blackwood was a Civil War veteran who had transitioned into industrial ventures, specifically operating mining concerns in the most remote and dangerous locations throughout Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. What Blackwood offered Thompson was a dramatically expanded market for his unique services. Reverend Thompson, Blackwood explained during their private meeting in the church office, I represent a consortium of mining operations that have been impressed by your innovative approach to labor acquisition. We have an immediate need for 500 able-bodied workers, and we're prepared to pay premium rates for rapid delivery. The math was staggering. At $75 per worker, triple Thompson's previous rate, this single contract would generate $37,500, more than most ministers earned in a lifetime. But Blackwood's proposal went far beyond a simple expansion of existing methods. We're not just interested in the dying and desperate, Blackwood continued. We need healthy workers who can contribute for years, not months. We're prepared to offer family packages, situations where entire households can benefit from relocation with generous compensation for wives and children. Thompson understood immediately. Instead of targeting only terminal cases, they would begin recruiting healthy workers under false pretenses, promising profitable employment in distant locations while actually delivering them into slavery. Families would receive insurance payouts for accidental deaths that never occurred, while the workers themselves disappeared into the industrial hell of illegal mining operations. Dr. Whitman was initially reluctant to participate in this expansion. Falsifying death certificates for legitimately ill patients was one thing, those men were likely to die anyway, and their families did benefit from early insurance payments. But deliberately targeting healthy workers crossed a line that made him deeply uncomfortable. Marcus, Whitman confided during one of their private consultations, what we've been doing serves a purpose. We've helped families in desperate situations, provided for widows and orphans who would otherwise face destitution. But this is something else entirely. Thompson's response revealed the complete moral transformation that had occurred over the previous 4 years. Cornelius, you're thinking too narrowly, Thompson replied, his voice carrying the same pastoral authority he used in sermons. These men will work productively for years, contributing to the industrial strength of our nation while providing security for their families. Instead of wasting away in these played-out mines, watching their lungs slowly fill with coal dust, they'll be building America's future in new territories. It's not cruelty, it's opportunity. The Reverend had become an expert at reframing slavery as salvation, presenting the complete destruction of families as family protection. His ability to justify the unjustifiable through religious rhetoric had evolved into something approaching genuine delusion, or perhaps something far worse. Samuel Crow required no convincing. The undertaker had profited substantially from the conspiracy and had developed a taste for the work that went beyond mere financial motivation. He began suggesting refinements to their methods, ways to make the process more efficient and less likely to attract attention. We need to vary our approach, Crow recommended. Too many deaths from the same causes might eventually draw questions. I can arrange mining accidents, house fires, even drownings. Each method requires different preparation, but the results are equally effective. The first family to be processed under the expanded system was the Hendersons, Robert, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage sons, Michael and James. Robert was a skilled carpenter who had been struggling to find steady work as mine construction slowed. Thompson approached him with an offer of lucrative employment building mining infrastructure in Colorado, with immediate advanced payment to help the family prepare for relocation. Robert saw it as an answer to prayer. The arrangement seemed generous and legitimate. Robert would travel ahead to establish housing and employment, while Sarah and the boys followed a few months later. To help with expenses, Thompson arranged for Robert to purchase a substantial life insurance policy, with the understanding it could be converted to family coverage once they were established in Colorado. What actually happened was that Robert was declared dead in a mining accident 2 weeks after his supposed departure. Sarah received a $1,000 insurance payout and a detailed account of her husband's tragic death in a tunnel collapse. She was told his body had been too badly damaged for return to Pennsylvania, but that he had been given a proper Christian burial by local authorities. 3 months later, Sarah and her sons were approached with a similar offer. Thompson explained that Robert had made arrangements before his death for his family to join him in Colorado, working with associates who would honor his wishes. The insurance money would cover their travel expenses, and profitable employment awaited them at their destination. Sarah, grieving and trusting the minister who had provided such comfort during her loss, agreed. She and her sons were given train tickets to what they believed was Colorado, but were actually transported to mining operations in remote areas of West Virginia, where they joined Robert in conditions resembling a prison camp. The Henderson case established the template for what would become known as family processing, a method that eliminated potential witnesses while maximizing both insurance profits and labor yields. Between 1871 and 1875, Thompson processed 43 complete families through this system, generating over $85,000 in insurance payments while delivering nearly 200 workers to Blackwood's consortium. But this expansion brought new risks. Unlike the original victims who were already facing death, the family processing system created victims who were healthy, connected to the community, and likely to be missed. Thompson needed new methods to explain their disappearances and prevent investigation. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. He began spreading stories of religious revival movements in the Western Territories, communities of faithful Christians establishing new settlements based on biblical principles. Families who joined these movements necessarily severed ties with their previous communities, dedicating themselves completely to their new spiritual calling. "The Lord is calling his people to new lands," Thompson announced from his pulpit, just as he called Abraham from Ur, Moses from Egypt, the disciples from their nets. Some among us have heard this calling and chosen to answer, to sacrifice the comfort of familiar surroundings for the greater glory of establishing God's kingdom in the wilderness. This religious framework provided perfect cover for family disappearances. When the Hendersons and other families vanished, community members assumed they had joined religious settlements and chosen to cut contact. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Religious enthusiasm often led to dramatic lifestyle changes, and the idea of Christian communities in frontier territories was entirely plausible. Thompson even arranged for occasional letters to be sent to Millbrook, supposedly from families who had successfully established themselves in these new communities. The letters, actually written by associates in distant cities, described successful farming ventures, growing religious communities, and deep satisfaction with their new lives. These communications reinforced the cover story while discouraging further inquiry. By 1875, Thompson's operation had evolved into something unprecedented in American criminal history, a systematic program of family destruction disguised as religious ministry, operating with the full trust and support of its victim community. The conspiracy had processed over 120 people, generated more than $150,000 in fraudulent insurance payments, and created a network of forced labor camps stretching across 3 states. But the very scale of this success was creating impossible problems. The high death and disappearance rate among St. Stephen's congregation was beginning to attract attention from church authorities, insurance investigators, and law enforcement. More critically, some original victims had survived long enough in the labor camps to begin planning escapes, and their intimate knowledge of Thompson's methods made them extremely dangerous. The shadows of the past were about to collide with the realities of the present, and the collision would expose secrets buried deeper than any of the empty coffins in St. Stephen's Cemetery. Just when we thought we understood the scope of Reverend Thompson's operation, we discover it was far more extensive and horrifying than anyone imagined. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our investigation of these forgotten crimes, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories that uncover the truth about America's hidden history. Now, let's see how this web of deception began to unravel. The beginning of the end came from the last person anyone would have suspected, Rebecca Morrison, the widow of James Morrison, Thompson's first victim from 7 years earlier. Rebecca had been one of Thompson's greatest success stories. After receiving her husband's insurance money in 1868, she had used it to open a small boarding house that catered to traveling salesmen and mining supervisors. The business prospered, and Rebecca became one of Millbrook's most respected widows, a testament to Thompson's program and the financial security it provided. But Rebecca Morrison was also one of the few people in Millbrook who read newspapers from other cities. In October of 1875, while reviewing a Philadelphia paper left by one of her boarders, she noticed a small article about labor conditions in the anthracite mines near Centralia. The piece mentioned a mine accident that had killed 15 workers, including several men whose background suggested they weren't typical miners. What caught Rebecca's attention was one name in the casualty list, James Morrison, age 38, originally from the Schuylkill region. The age was wrong, her James would have been 41 by 1875, but the name and regional origin created an impossible coincidence. Rebecca began collecting newspapers from other cities, searching for any mention of mining accidents, labor disputes, or unusual deaths. What she discovered over the following months created a pattern that chilled her to the bone. Names kept appearing, not just variations, but exact matches. Thomas McKenna, who had supposedly died of black lung in 1869. Patrick O'Sullivan, officially deceased from a mining accident in 1870. Benjamin Fletcher, heart attack victim in 1871. The newspaper accounts described them as active workers who had died in various industrial accidents between 1872 and 1875, years after their official deaths and funerals in Millbrook. Rebecca faced an impossible situation. Either multiple men in Pennsylvania shared identical names with recently deceased members of her community, or the men she had mourned were still alive, or at least had been alive for years after their supposed deaths. Her first instinct was to approach Reverend Thompson, seeking his guidance. But something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was a subtle memory of his quick, smooth explanations for previous strange occurrences. Perhaps it was the way he had immediately discouraged discussion when others reported seeing deceased relatives. Instead, Rebecca decided to conduct her own investigation. Using her boarding house as a base, Rebecca began corresponding with newspapers, coroners, and mining authorities in the regions where deceased Millbrook residents had supposedly died in industrial accidents. Her questions were carefully framed as those of a grieving community member seeking to understand a tragic pattern. The responses painted a picture that defied every assumption about death and community trust. According to mining records, James Morrison had been employed by the Centralia Deep Coal Company from March 1868 until his death in October 1875, a period beginning just 2 months after his funeral in Millbrook. Employment records described him as a skilled miner recruited from eastern Pennsylvania. He had lived in company housing, received company pay, and was buried in the company cemetery. The same pattern emerged for other names. Men mourned and buried in Millbrook had actually been working in remote mining operations for years after their supposed deaths, under their real names. This forced a terrible conclusion: either the concept of death had become unreliable, or the men buried in St. Stephen's Cemetery weren't actually there at all. Rebecca made a decision that would expose the entire conspiracy. On a cold November night in 1875, she recruited her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, and 2 trusted neighbors to investigate James Morrison's grave. Working by lamplight, they expected to find either human remains or evidence of desecration. What they found was a coffin full of stones and sawdust, carefully arranged to approximate a human body. The discovery was devastating, but it created a new problem: they now possessed evidence of a crime obtained through illegal means. Disturbing a grave was a serious offense. More importantly, they had no way of knowing how extensive the conspiracy was. If Thompson was involved, who else was complicit? Dr. Whitman had signed the death certificates. Samuel Crowe had prepared the bodies. Were local authorities involved? Rebecca decided to document her findings before approaching any officials. Over the following weeks, she and her associates secretly examined 6 more graves, finding the same evidence each time: coffins filled with stones, containing no human remains. Meanwhile, Thompson was sensing new risks. The expansion into family processing had created logistical challenges and increased the number of people with dangerous knowledge. Some processed families had extended relatives in other communities asking uncomfortable questions. More troubling were reports from Blackwood's consortium about problems in the labor camps. Several original victims had survived longer than expected and were beginning to organize resistance. Some escapes had been successful, and these men possessed intimate knowledge of Thompson's methods. Thompson began making preparations for what he privately called Operational Conclusion, the systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses that would allow him to relocate and establish similar operations elsewhere. This included plans for dealing with community members who had discovered too much. Rebecca Morrison had no way of knowing her investigation had attracted Thompson's attention, or that her name had been added to a list of people posing unacceptable risks. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the truth would be exposed or buried forever with its witnesses. Rebecca held evidence that could destroy the operation, but Thompson held power over an entire community and resources to eliminate a troublesome widow. The question was not whether they would clash, but whether anyone would survive to tell the story. The confrontation began on a grey December morning in 1875, when Rebecca made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. She decided to approach Dr. Whitman first, believing his medical training and professional ethics would make him a reliable ally. She reasoned that if he had been deceived, he would want to correct the record. If he was complicit, her approach would force him to reveal himself. She believed she could manage that risk. She was catastrophically wrong on both counts. When Rebecca presented her evidence to Dr. Whitman, showing him photographs of the opened graves and documentation about deceased miners working elsewhere, his reaction was immediate and chilling. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "you have made a very serious mistake coming here." Within hours, Rebecca found herself confronting not just Whitman's betrayal, but the full extent of the conspiracy. Thompson arrived at the office accompanied by Samuel Crowe and two rough-looking strangers. "Rebecca," Thompson said, his pastoral voice devoid of its usual warmth, "you discovered something that puts not just you, but your entire community at risk. The work we've been doing serves a greater purpose than you understand. These men have contributed to industrial progress that benefits the entire nation. The families who received insurance payments have been saved from destitution. What seems like deception is actually divine providence working through human agency." Thompson's attempt to justify the conspiracy through religious rhetoric revealed the complete moral corruption that had transformed him from minister to monster. But Rebecca was no longer the grieving widow, she had become an informed and determined adversary. "You're not serving God," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're serving yourself. You've turned our church into a slaughterhouse, our community into a hunting ground, and our faith into a marketplace for human souls. James is dead now, or really dead. And so are all the others. They died as slaves in your minds, far from their families, believing they had sacrificed themselves for a noble purpose. You've committed murder, Reverend Thompson. Mass murder disguised as ministry." The accusation hit its target. Thompson's carefully constructed justifications crumbled. For a moment, the mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "What you call murder, Mrs. Morrison, has provided security for dozens of families and productive labor for expanding industries. These men would have died anyway. We simply redirected their deaths to serve a useful purpose." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, medical bag in hand. "Rebecca, you're clearly distraught. The evidence you think you found can be explained through rational means. Grave robbing is a serious crime, and the stress has obviously affected your mental state. I'm going to give you something to help you rest, and then we can discuss how to address this properly." But Rebecca had anticipated this. Before coming, she had left detailed documentation with her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, with instructions to contact Philadelphia authorities if she didn't return by evening. She had also sent copies of her evidence to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Pennsylvania State Police. "Dr. Whitman," Rebecca said, backing toward the door, "if you approach me with that bag, you'll be committing assault in front of witnesses. And gentlemen, if anything happens to me today, detailed evidence of your conspiracy will be in the hands of state authorities by tomorrow morning." The revelation that Rebecca had taken precautions changed everything. Thompson and his associates faced a choice between immediate violence that would certainly expose them, or allowing her to leave with knowledge that might expose them eventually. Thompson chose a middle path that would be his final mistake. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "you're acting on incomplete information. Yes, we have been creative in our methods of helping families, but you don't understand the full scope. Would you be willing to see the complete picture before making final judgments? Would you visit one of our operations, speak with the men you think are victims, see for yourself how they live and work?" It was a trap, of course. An offer to visit a mining operation where Rebecca would suffer a fatal accident. But Rebecca had spent months studying Thompson's methods and recognized the pattern. "I'll consider your offer," she replied carefully, "but only if you agree to my conditions. I want a visit accompanied by independent witnesses, representatives from the State Mining Authority or Philadelphia newspapers. I want advance notice of exactly where we're going and when. And I want guarantees about communication with outside authorities during the visit." These conditions made the trap impossible to execute, but they also revealed that Rebecca understood his proposal completely. The pretense of peaceful resolution evaporated. Samuel Crowe spoke for the first time, his voice flat. "She knows too much, and she's prepared too well. This ends one of two ways: she disappears tonight, or we all hang next month." The blunt assessment forced everyone to confront their situation. Thompson's conspiracy had grown too large to contain and too documented to deny. Rebecca possessed evidence that could destroy them, and her precautions made it impossible to silence her without confirming her accusations. But Thompson had spent 7 years building his operation, generating enormous profits, and convincing himself his crimes served a higher purpose. He wasn't prepared to surrender. "Mrs. Morrison," Thompson said finally, "the men in this room have committed themselves completely to our mission. We've moved beyond the point where retreat is possible. If our work is exposed, dozens of families will lose the insurance payments that have sustained them. Hundreds of workers will be abandoned in mining operations where they have no legal status. The economic disruption will destroy this community." It was a desperate attempt at moral blackmail, suggesting that exposure would harm the very people it had victimized. But Rebecca had anticipated this, too. "Reverend Thompson," she replied, "you're describing the consequences of your crimes, not reasons to continue committing them. Those families received money stolen through fraud. Those workers are slaves who deserve rescue. And this community deserves the truth." The exchange marked the end of negotiation and the beginning of what Thompson called operational termination, the systematic elimination of threats. But Rebecca had made one final preparation Thompson couldn't have anticipated. As she spoke her last words in Whitman's office, 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigators were already on a train to Millbrook, summoned by the evidence she had mailed to Harrisburg 3 days earlier. They arrived that evening armed with warrants, accompanied by federal marshals who had been investigating reports of forced labor. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of horses and carriages outside, sounds marking the beginning of the largest criminal investigation in Pennsylvania's history and the end of Thompson's reign. What happened next would expose not just the scope of the conspiracy, but the horrifying conditions in the labor camps and the network of corruption that had allowed such systematic evil to flourish under religious authority. The arrest of Reverend Marcus Thompson, Dr. Cornelius Whitman, and Samuel Crowe on December 15, 1875, began an investigation that exposed the largest human trafficking operation in American history to that date. Pennsylvania State Police Captain William McCready, who led the investigation, later wrote in his report, "In 23 years of law enforcement, I have never encountered crimes of such scope and systematic cruelty." The conspiracy operated with the efficiency of a business enterprise and the moral authority of religious ministry, creating a perfect storm of exploitation.